Hello everyone, I'm Rebecca Keppel. In today's video, I am sharing a way to stretch your supplies by using your coordinating dies without their stamp partners in 5 different ways. Purchasing coordinating dies can get a little bit pricey for all those stamp sets that we just have to have. So I like to find other ways to use supplies to give them more bang for their buck. First up, we're going to use leaf or leaves dies to create a wreath or a laurel. To create my wreath or my laurel, I'm using the Stamp Market's Jumbo Layered Lovely stamp set, and it has coordinating dies. So I'm going to use 2 of the coordinating dies like these ones that are the leaves, and I'm going to cut them out of some green cardstock. Then I'm going to cut out a circle, scalloped circle out of a blue cardstock and the tiny tile cover die out of white. I'm using Ultra Bond in the pen format today to adhere down the tiny tile covered die cut to some A2 white cardstock. Then I'm going to take some foam squares and I'm going to cut them in half so that I can pop up that scalloped circle. And the half pieces of foam squares fit perfectly behind that little scalloped circle. So I just peel off those back protective layers, brush them aside, and then lay that down on top of the card panel that I'm working on. The tiny tile cover just adds nice texture. Then I'm going to use these leaf die cuts. Now again, I didn't use the stamps. I'm just cut out the leaves out of green cardstock and I'm going to adhere them down to the circle. The circle is basically a template for me to work around so that I can see how these leaves should be adhered that will look like a laurel. And to finish it off, I'm going to use the Hello die cut on some white cardstock that has iCraft Easy Cut behind it, which is a thin double-sided adhesive so that I can just peel them off and stick them down. If you haven't seen the Hello word die from the Stamp Market, I love that the H is separate from the rest of the word. It makes it really easy to get everything nice and straight and in place on the shadow, which I cut in Kraft for the background. So now I'm just going to add some of those foam squares to the back of this. It's very easy to do with the shadow. For the first layer, if you really wanted to pop that up, I would just cut out several layers, and we'll do that later in the video as well. So I'm just going to put a few little pieces of foam squares, peel off those protective layers, and then place this right inside the laurel wreath that we created with those leaf die cuts. And then just maybe a few enamel dots just for a third color there. I really like that pop of yellow with the Kraft white, green, and blue. So that's just a really easy way to use leaf die cuts without their coordinating stamps to create a wreath or a laurel. If you don't have time for stamping and die cutting, another way to make those die cuts shine is to add a little bit of ink blending to the edges. For this card, I'm using the Stamp Market's curved cover die for the background. I've cut it out of Kraft Cardstock from the Stamp Market and then white cardstock. And I'm alternating the rays of the curve from each color. And I love the way their Kraft looks with white. I think Kraft and white are such a great subtle neutral combination, and we'll have some fun with color on top with some other cardstock and ink. So I have the Stamp Market Sea Glass ink and Fresh Pink ink, and I've also die cut from their Wild Stems stamp and dies, and I'm just using the dies. I didn't use the stamps. I'm just cutting out the Wild Stems dies from Fresh Pink and then from Sea Glass, and then I'm using their ink blender to just add some ink blending to the edges of these die cuts. It's the same color ink on cardstock, so it's not a really harsh look. It's a very, very subtle look, and I absolutely love it. And it looks great on the Kraft and white background. So this is just a fun way to take a basic die cut that you created. You don't have to use the stamps, but you can use some ink to kind of make it a little bit more special or give it a little bit of depth and dimension so that when you add it to your background, it really pops and stands out. So this time I'm using the Happiest High and Hello dies again, only I'm using the highs this time, and I don't have any of the thin double-sided adhesive sheets left, so I am using Thermoweb's Ultra Bond in the pen format. The tip is definitely fine enough to get around those thin die cuts, which makes me so happy because you don't always have those adhesive sheets to be able to cut them out. The other great thing about the Ultra Bond is it has the same qualities as the regular Ultra Bond, where if you put it down, it's not going to dry right away. It's going to give you a few seconds to kind of move things around. I have a little tool picker upper that I used for the dot on the eye because I was unable to grab it myself. I'm going to do the same thing I did last time with these 3D foam squares. They really cut in half perfectly and then are able to be placed behind even sort of smaller die cuts. This is a large die cut, but I wanted all of those leaves popped up, and the same for this guy here. I did pop up the bottom, and then I just put a little bit of liquid glue behind the top so that it would stay adhered to the top of the pink stem there because I didn't want it to be folded down or get ruined in the mail or anything. I did pop up the little high as well, and then I'm just going to add some clear enamel dots because I just could add clear enamel dots to pretty much every card I ever make. I love them so much. And I love the really big ones that the stamp market has. They're pretty cool. So if you're thinking about using your coordinating dies without the stamps, think about doing a little ink blending just to make them extra special. Card makers have been stacking sentiment dies for a long time to create dimensional sentiments, but you can stack those other dies as well, your coordinating dies, to create three-dimensional embellishments. For this card, I'm going to use Concord and Ninth's Seasonal Branches bundle. So I'm going to cut out the branch and 3 different leaves. And I'm going to use the Ultra Bond to adhere all these layers together so that we're going to have a branch and 3 leaves that are all incredibly dimensional. You can see that this branch is way too thin to use foam adhesive behind it. So this is a really great way to just stack these die cuts and make them into dimensional embellishments instead of just flat to the card or even popped up on foam. It has a totally different look. You can see the thickness of each piece and there's nothing behind them. So it just looks very cool. I'm also going to use one of the Plaid dies, and I have die cut these all out of Concord and Ninth cardstock. I'm going to use some of the Ultra Bond pen to adhere that Plaid die cut down to an A2 piece of white cardstock. And once that's adhered and straight in its place, I'm going to use the same liquid glue to adhere the branch right down to the top of the card. And like I said, you can just see how sturdy and thick this thin little branch is. It just looks totally different when it's 3 layers than when it's just 1. And I really love the way it pops up off the card. I'm going to do the same thing with these leaves, and I'm going to place these leaves along the branch. This stamp set actually has flowers as well, but I thought, these leaves are just perfect as is, whereas the flower, you might have to stamp the actual image to understand what it is. But the leaves, they're perfect. You don't need to do any stamping. You can just die cut them out 3 times, adhere them all together, and then adhere them down to the card. So like I mentioned, I cut out this You're So Kind sentiment from the same die set. And I'm going to adhere 4 of these together because I really want them to stand out on the background there, which that plaid is, a little bit busy on its own. So I really want the sentiment to be seen. That's why I also cut it out of the navy cardstock. So this is very delicate. I would have loved to have some easy cut here, but you can make it work with the Ultra Bond. So I'm going to adhere 3 of them together and then put some adhesive on the back. This way, when I adhere my 4th one on top, I know it's nice and clean because I was getting little bits of adhesive on my fingers and on the die cuts and all of that. So I was able to adhere it down and then put a clean one right on top. And I just love all that dimension. This seems like an obvious one, but sometimes I forget to use my pattern paper. If you cut out pattern paper out of coordinating dies, it adds a whole different look to them. For this next card, I'm going to be using Catherine Pooler's Hip Hearts. There's a stamp set and then there's coordinating dies. These two dies are small, therefore these stamps on the sides here, I'm not going to use those because you can't really tell what they are, but you can tell what these big hearts are. So I'm going to use the Simon Says Stamp Transparency to line up a sentiment from the stamp set right in the middle of a horizontal A2 piece of white cardstock that I've cut on the sides so that I can mat it on some gray cardstock. So I'm just going to place the stamp on the transparency, pick it up on the MISTI, and then remove the transparency. I put it back in the little envelope that it came in so I keep it safe. And then I'm going to ink up the stamp with the Stamp Market's Slate Ink, which is a nice gray. I thought it would go well with the gray cardstock in the back and then the gray stripes on some of the hearts. So I've cut the hearts out of some pattern paper from Catherine Pooler. It's actually a slimline pattern paper pad called Best Friends. And I figured since the stamps for the hearts stamp patterns, these pattern paper heart die cuts would work perfectly instead of stamping if you don't have time for that. So I put the two large hearts around the sentiment flat to the card with some tape runner, and then I'm popping up a medium heart and a small heart next to each of them, and I'm just kind of mixing, matching the patterns here. And I think this just is a clean and simple card that says you're my person. Super, super cute and an easy way to use those coordinating dies. If you don't have pattern paper though, maybe try cutting out cardstock and adding white gel pen details to your cardstock die cuts. For this card, I'm going to use Catherine Pooler's Quilted Cover Plate die. You may have seen me use this cover plate before. I really like it a lot. I think it's a very versatile looking background and it's just graphic and fun. So this time I cut the hearts out of some cardstock and I'll be using my favorite white gel pen. If you haven't seen my video about it, I'm going to link to it up in the right-hand corner here. And I'm just going to draw stitch lines around each of the cardstock hearts that I cut out. This is really easy to do. It takes just a few minutes, especially once you get in the groove and get going and decide, how big you want your stitches and how close together you want them. But look at how cute those little white stitches look. Now, I am not detailed enough with a sewing machine to be able to stitch around tiny little die cut hearts like this. So I love to use the white gel pen to add those faux stitch details. And I just think they look adorable. It just completely changes them up. I'm also going to use one to stamp the sentiment on. It just says, I love you. It's also from the Hip Heart stamp set. And I'm going to stamp it in some black ink right on the largest heart that I am using on this card. Look at that. It's super adorable and was so easy to make. And it just takes those coordinating dies and stretches them further. And that's what we want because they can get expensive. I know. So I definitely like to find lots of ways like this to use them. And then I just popped them up on top of that background panel that we created. And this is just that type of clean and simple card that I absolutely love making. I hope this video inspired you to take out those coordinating dies, even if you're not taking out the stamps, to stretch those supplies and use them in lots of different ways. If you love finding fun and unique ways to use the basic supplies that you already have, check out this entire playlist over here. As always, I want to thank you so much for spending time with me today. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you again soon. Card makers have been taken care of. Now you're not taking care of. Babysitting die cuts. So it's gonna be weird and choppy. Okay, weird and choppy. That's my motto.